2:09 a.m. Low Earth orbit, 412 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean. No atmosphere, no sound, no weather, just the absolute silence of space and the curve of the Earth below. The night side of the planet spread out from horizon to horizon, city lights tracing the coastlines of Japan and South Korea and the Philippines in gold and white, the vast black emptiness of the ocean between them, and above it all, moving at 7.5 kilometers per second, the USS Keyhole 20, a National Reconnaissance Office optical reconnaissance satellite, the most capable imaging platform ever placed in orbit by any nation, classified at the highest level. Its existence not officially acknowledged. Its capabilities beyond anything publicly described. She was passing over the Yellow Sea on a ground track that would carry her sensors across the Chinese naval buildup at Zhangjiang, the South Sea Fleet headquarters where NRO analysts had been observing an unusual concentration of amphibious assault vessels for the previous 9 days. The satellite's imaging systems were configured and ready. In 37 seconds, she would be in optimal position. In 38 seconds, she would begin imaging. In 40 seconds, the data would begin downlinking to the ground station at Pine Gap, Australia. At 2:09 a.m. and 14 seconds, a PLA Strategic Support Force ground-based laser installation at Kashgar in Xinjiang province fired a high-powered dazzler beam at the Keyhole 20's optical sensor array. The beam traveled at the speed of light. It arrived at the satellite in 0.0014 seconds. The optical sensor array, the most sophisticated imaging system ever built, was permanently blinded in 1.3 seconds of sustained dazzler exposure. The satellite continued its orbit. Its bus systems continued functioning, but its eyes were gone. The Keyhole 20 would never image anything again. 41 seconds later, at 2:09 a.m. and 55 seconds, a PLA co-orbital anti-satellite vehicle designated Shijian-21B, which had been maneuvering for weeks in a transfer orbit that brought it progressively closer to the GPS constellation in medium Earth orbit, fired a kinetic kill vehicle at GPS Block 3A satellite SVN-77. The kill vehicle, traveling at a relative closing speed of 3 kilometers per second, struck SVN-77 amidships and destroyed it in a debris cloud of 4,000 pieces. SVN-77 provided GPS signal coverage across a primary zone encompassing the Western Pacific, from Guam to Japan to the Philippines. The loss of SVN-77 alone would not have blinded GPS in the region. The constellation had redundancy built in precisely to survive individual satellite losses, but China had planned for that. Over the previous 11 months, the PLA Strategic Support Force had identified the specific constellation geometry that, if 2 additional satellites were degraded or destroyed, would create a GPS accuracy gap over a defined Pacific operational area exceeding 60% degradation of precision navigation for a period of 4 to 6 hours. Sufficient time for a major military operation to be launched and to achieve its opening objectives before the U.S. Space Force could maneuver backup satellites into compensating positions. At 2:10 a.m., a second Shijian co-orbital vehicle fired at GPS SVN-81. Struck. Destroyed. At 2:10 a.m. and 19 seconds, the Kashgar ground laser shifted frequency and attacked the GPS SVN-74 downlink antenna with a jamming signal powerful enough to corrupt its broadcast signal across its entire coverage zone. SVN-74 did not go offline. It continued transmitting. But what it transmitted was noise. 3 GPS satellites degraded or destroyed. 1 strategic reconnaissance satellite blinded. In 93 seconds, in Colorado Springs, at Schriever Space Force Base, the Combined Space Operations Center erupted. Alarms, loss of contact notifications, debris cloud alerts. The watch team had trained for this. They had trained for it for 3 years. They knew exactly what the pattern of losses meant. This was not a malfunction. This was not a collision. This was a coordinated attack. The pattern of satellite kills, 2 actual destructions, and 1 signal corruption, had been specifically designed to create the maximum GPS degradation over the Western Pacific, while minimizing the debris field that would trigger international outcry. The watch commander transmitted a flash alert to U.S. Indo-Pacific Command at Camp Smith, Hawaii, to Strategic Command at Offutt, to the National Military Command Center, to Space Force Headquarters, to the White House Situation Room. The alert said 4 words in addition to the technical data: China, ASAT, attack, confirmed. In the Pacific, the effects were already spreading. F-35s at Kadena Air Base conducting a scheduled night training mission received GPS degradation warnings in their cockpits simultaneously. The navigation system shifted to inertial backup, still functional, but with drift errors that would grow over time. USS Ronald Reagan's GPS navigation picture flickered, then stabilized at reduced accuracy as her system switched to the JASSM targeting chain's backup algorithms. The P-8 Poseidons on maritime patrol over the South China Sea reported GPS accuracy degraded to 37 meters, still usable, but far below the sub-meter precision that modern precision-guided weapons required. Across the Pacific Theater, for the first time in 30 years, American forces were navigating with degraded precision. That was the point. That was what Beijing had calculated would happen next. With American precision-guided weapons degraded, with the reconnaissance satellite blinded, with the U.S. military scrambling to understand what had happened and what was coming, the window would be open. The amphibious fleet at Zhangjiang would sail. The first wave of J-20S would go feet wet toward Taiwan, and America would be fighting with one eye closed and its precision weapons stumbling. Beijing had made 5 catastrophic mistakes. The first mistake: they believed the Keyhole 20 was the only American imaging satellite with coverage of the Zhangjiang buildup. It was not. The NRO operated multiple satellite families on complementary ground tracks specifically to prevent a single kill from creating a persistent blind spot. At the moment, the Keyhole 20 was blinded. An NRO radar imaging satellite in a different orbital plane was 47 minutes from optimal Zhangjiang coverage. A commercial satellite imagery tasking order, pre-authorized for exactly this contingency, went to 3 separate commercial operators within 6 minutes of the Keyhole 20 loss. By 3:30 a.m., the Zhangjiang amphibious fleet was being imaged by 4 separate systems. Beijing had not blinded American intelligence. It had inconvenienced it for 81 minutes. The second mistake: they destroyed GPS SVN-77 and SVN-81 and assumed the debris fields and coverage gaps would take 4 to 6 hours to compensate for. They had not accounted for the 3 GPS-3 follow-on satellites that the Space Force had pre-positioned in parking orbits above the standard constellation altitude as an on-orbit reserve specifically for this contingency. A classified capability that had been developed and deployed following a 2022 space threat assessment that had identified the Shijian co-orbital vehicle program as a first-strike ASAT threat. Within 41 minutes of the SVN-77 destruction, the Space Force had maneuvered 1 reserve satellite into a compensating position. Within 93 minutes, 2 more were maneuvering. The GPS degradation window over the Western Pacific was not 4 to 6 hours. It was 93 minutes. The third mistake: the Kashgar ground laser installation that had blinded the Keyhole 20 and jammed SVN-74 had been tracked by American intelligence for 22 months. Its precise coordinates, its power plant configuration, its antenna orientation, and its operational patterns had been mapped in detail by the very satellite it had just blinded on one of its previous passes, and by a separate SIGINT satellite that had recorded every emission the facility had produced since its construction. The targeting data was precise. The facility was in the targeting database. It had been in the targeting database for 9 months. The fourth mistake: the 2 Shijian co-orbital vehicles that had fired kinetic kill vehicles at GPS satellites were still in orbit, still trackable. still broadcasting telemetry that identified their orbits, their fuel states, and their remaining payload configurations. The Space Fence ground-based radar at Kwajalein Atoll had been tracking both vehicles continuously for 6 weeks. Their orbital parameters, updated every pass, were in the Space Force targeting system. Destroying them was not a new problem requiring new solutions. It was an existing target with pre-computed intercept solutions waiting for authorization. The fifth mistake, the one that exposed the catastrophic miscalculation at the heart of the entire operation, was the assumption that attacking American space assets would be treated by Washington as an ambiguous act requiring cautious, measured response calibrated to avoid escalation. That assumption was grounded in the previous 15 years of American behavior in response to incremental Chinese provocations, the gradual island building, the progressive encroachment, the steady pressure that had consistently been met with statements of concern rather than consequences. The CMC had extrapolated from that pattern and concluded that attacking satellites, killing machines in space, not people on the ground, would produce the same cautious diplomatic response. They had not read the classified space policy directive that had been signed 14 months earlier, which defined attacks on U.S. national security space assets as acts of war, subject to the full range of U.S. response options, including kinetic action against the ground infrastructure that had enabled the attack. The NSC convened at 2:31 a.m., 22 minutes after the first satellite kill. The pre-planned response package was presented. The President authorized it at 2:44 a.m., 35 minutes after the first Chinese weapon fired in space. What happened in the next 52 minutes established the new rules of space warfare. At 2:46 a.m., the Space Force activated its ground-based ASAT capability, a system that had been acknowledged in broad terms, but whose specific capabilities had never been publicly described. From a classified launch facility, 2 direct-ascent kinetic interceptors were launched on trajectories calculated to intercept the 2 Shijian co-orbital vehicles in their current orbital positions. The interceptors were not hasty improvisations. Their trajectories had been pre-computed from the continuously updated Shijian orbital parameters maintained by Space Fence. The launches were precise. The interceptors climbed on their prescribed trajectories in the dark above the Pacific. The first interceptor reached its intercept point at 3:11 a.m. and destroyed Shijian 21B, the vehicle that had killed SVN-77, with a direct hit at a closing velocity of 4.2 kilometers per second. The debris field was tracked by Space Fence and assessed as manageable. The Space Force had specifically calculated the intercept geometry to minimize debris scatter into operational orbit bands. The second Shijian vehicle was intercepted at 3:19 a.m. Both Chinese co-orbital ASAT vehicles were destroyed in their own debris clouds 22 minutes apart. China's co-orbital ASAT capability in low and medium Earth orbit had been neutralized. Simultaneously, U.S. Cyber Command executed a pre-planned offensive cyber operation against the PLA Strategic Support Force's satellite command and control network. The operation, designated Silent Meridian, had been developed over the previous 16 months by targeting the specific software vulnerabilities in the ground station infrastructure that controlled China's military satellite constellation. Silent Meridian did not destroy Chinese satellites. It corrupted the uplink command sequences used to maneuver them. For a period of 4 hours and 17 minutes, the PLA Strategic Support Force was unable to send precision maneuvering commands to 11 of its 23 military satellites, including its 2 Yaogan 30 naval reconnaissance satellites that were providing real-time tracking data to the Zhangjiang amphibious fleet. China's eyes in space were not destroyed. They were made blind and deaf for 4 hours. The timing was precise. For the 4 hours and 17 minutes that Silent Meridian was active, the Zhangjiang amphibious fleet could not receive real-time satellite tracking of American carrier positions in the Western Pacific. They were operating blind on the most important tactical question their commanders needed answered. At 2:51 a.m., 4 B-21 Raider stealth bombers, a system whose operational capability in this theater had not been publicly acknowledged, departed Andersen Air Force Base on Guam on a mission profile that had been preloaded into their navigation systems before the attack had even begun. The B-21's radar cross-section made it effectively undetectable to current-generation Chinese air defense radars. Each aircraft carried 6 AGM-158C long-range anti-ship missiles and 8 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators. Their targets were divided into 2 categories. Category 1, the Kashgar laser installation in Xinjiang province that had blinded the Keyhole 20 and jammed SVN-74. The facility was 1,200 kilometers from the nearest Chinese coast, deep in the continental interior, a location its designers had chosen specifically because it was beyond the range of carrier-based strike aircraft and too far inland for cruise missile attack from the sea to be cost-effective. It was not beyond the range of a B-21 Raider with a full fuel load and a pre-planned strike profile. 2 B-21s were assigned to Kashgar. They carried 8 GBU-57 penetrating bombs between them, assigned to the laser installation's primary power plant, its cooling infrastructure, its antenna arrays, and its hardened command module. The facility had been constructed to resist conventional aerial attack. It had not been constructed to resist a weapon that could penetrate 60 meters of reinforced concrete. The B-21s reached Kashgar at 4:17 a.m. They were not detected by any Chinese radar on their approach. The laser installation, which had been tracking satellites and preparing for a follow-on attack, received no warning before the first GBU-57 impacted its primary antenna array at 4:17 a.m. and 41 seconds. 4 sequential penetrator impacts across 4 assigned aim points. The power plant was destroyed. The laser arrays were destroyed. The command module was collapsed by a direct GBU-57 penetration. The Kashgar ground laser installation that had blinded the most sophisticated reconnaissance satellite in American history ceased to exist as a functional military asset in 11 seconds. Category 2. The 3 PLA Strategic Support Force ground station complexes that controlled the Shijian co-orbital ASAT vehicles and the Yaogan military reconnaissance constellation. One at Weinan in Shanxi province, one at Kashi in Xinjiang, one at Miyun outside Beijing. These facilities were the nervous system of Chinese military space operations. Without them, whatever satellites remained in orbit could not receive commands, could not adjust their orbits, could not download their collected intelligence. The 2 B-21s assigned to Category 2 targets released their JASSM-ER cruise missiles from outside Chinese air defense coverage, the missiles flying their terrain-following profiles toward their pre-assigned coordinates. The Weinan ground station was struck at 4:09 a.m. by 6 JASSM-ERs that collapsed the antenna farm and the command building simultaneously. The Kashi ground station, a backup facility for the Kashgar laser installation that also served as the primary uplink for the Yaogan 30 naval reconnaissance satellites, was struck at 4:14 a.m. The Miyun facility, the most sensitive target geographically given its proximity to Beijing, was struck by 2 JASSM-ERs that had been precision targeted against the antenna arrays and downlink infrastructure, while specifically avoiding the surrounding residential areas. The strike packages had been engineered with the geometry required to hit the antennas and avoid everything within 200 meters of the facility perimeter. By 4:22 a.m., all 3 PLA Strategic Support Force ground stations were non-operational. China's military space operations infrastructure, the ground segment that controlled its ASAT weapons, its reconnaissance satellites, and its navigation augmentation systems, had been destroyed across 4 facilities simultaneously, penetrating 1,200 kilometers into the Chinese continental interior, without a single Chinese radar detecting the aircraft that delivered the strikes. At 4:30 a.m., U.S. Space Force completed the maneuvering of the 2nd and 3rd Reserve GPS satellites into their compensating orbital positions. GPS accuracy over the Western Pacific was restored to sub-meter precision across 94% of the theater coverage area. The GPS constellation was fully compensated. Both Chinese ASAT vehicles were destroyed. The Kashgar laser was rubble. 3 ground stations were non-operational. Silent Meridian was still active, keeping 11 Chinese military satellites blind to ground command for another 2 hours. In Beijing, the CMC convened an emergency session at 3 a.m. when the Shijian vehicle telemetry went offline. By 4:30 a.m., when the damage reports from Kashgar, Weinan, and Kashi arrived, the session had been ongoing for 90 minutes with no resolution. The Zhanjiang amphibious fleet, which had been preparing to sail on the assumption that American space assets were degraded and American intelligence was blind, had not yet left its anchorage. Its commanders were waiting for the satellite reconnaissance updates that were not coming, because the satellites could not receive commands, because the ground stations that sent those commands were burning. The fleet did not sail. It stood down at 6 a.m. by order of the Eastern Theater Command, which had concluded that the operation's enabling conditions, American space degradation, American intelligence blindness, had not only failed to materialize but had been reversed more rapidly and more decisively than any pre-operational assessment had predicted. The final accounting was documented by the National Space Council and Pacific Command over the subsequent 72 hours. American satellite losses. Keyhole 20, optical sensor permanently degraded. Satellite bus operational, imagery capability lost. GPS SVN-77, destroyed. GPS SVN-81, destroyed. GPS SVN-74, signal corruption, resolved by ground command within 41 minutes. Total GPS capability degradation window, 93 minutes. Keyhole 20 replacement imaging achieved by alternate systems within 81 minutes. Chinese assets destroyed or neutralized. Shijian 21. B co-orbital ASAT vehicle, destroyed. Second Shijian co-orbital ASAT vehicle, destroyed. Kashgar laser installation, destroyed. Weinan ground station, destroyed. Kashi ground station, destroyed. Mayun ground station antenna infrastructure, destroyed. 11 Chinese military satellites rendered uncontrollable for 4 hours and 17 minutes by Silent Meridian. American personnel casualties, 0. No aircraft lost. No ships damaged. The entire operation, from first Chinese weapon fired to last American strike impacting, had been conducted at 0 cost in American lives. In the Space Force Operations Center at Schriever, the watch team that had been awake since the first alarm stood down from flash posture at 5:30 a.m. The watch commander filed his after-action report. He noted that every system had performed within predicted parameters. He noted that the pre-planned response timeline had been met at every phase point. He noted that the GPS constellation was fully operational and that American precision navigation capability had been restored to the Western Pacific Theater. He also noted in the final line of his report that the space fence had already acquired and was tracking the debris fields from both Shijian intercepts, and that neither debris cloud presented a significant collision risk to the operational satellite constellation. The sky above the Pacific was clear. The GPS signals were strong. The satellites were watching. They are always watching. This is what happens when you fire the first shot in space and believe that altitude is protection. This is what happens when you blind one American eye and discover that America was watching you with 4 others, that the eyes you blinded have been replaced before the morning is over, that the weapons you used to blind them are now tumbling debris in decaying orbits, and that the ground stations that controlled them are rubble in 3 Chinese provinces. The Keyhole 20 moves through its orbit in silence. Its eyes are dark, but the constellation that replaced it is already working, already watching, already building the picture that the next mission will require. Space is not a sanctuary. It never was, and the forces that defend it are as precise, as pre-positioned, and as utterly overwhelming as anything that operates in the air or on the sea below. The GPS signal is strong. The satellites are watching. They always will be.